Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of When the Heart Leads. I am your host, Dr. Kate Newburgh, founder of Books of Eden Publishing, and I'm so happy to be with you today. The title of this episode is Your Highest Timeline. And we're going to go on a bit of a journey this podcast episode. So there's one keynote that I want you to keep coming back to. If you're ever getting a little lost in the different transmissions that are coming in, just know that the biggest thing we're getting at here is that there is nothing that can't be restored, right? Nothing in your life, or as we'll discuss in the larger arc of humanity, that can't be restored. So let's dive in. I want to start by talking a little bit about the idea of timelines themselves, because we're going to get into what these actually are and how they manifest physically in our very bodies. And if you're familiar with spiritual circles or metaphysical circles or New Age, you may have heard this a lot, this idea of your highest timeline, dissolving old timelines, right? And you may have your own understanding of this, but I want to talk about what this means or how I'm approaching the idea of timeline. So as we do this, I want you to be thinking about, we're going to be approaching it from two different planes. Of course, we know there are infinite planes of existence, right? So we're just going to be looking at two right now. And so there is first the timeline, the plane of linear time, right? So when we incarnate, what happens is, as I wrote in my memoir, we become slowed and stretched into linear time, into this place of countless, as I wrote, countless and thens, right? And this experience of linear time allows us to perceive the universe as unfolding, as evolving, as coming into blossom, you could say. And it places us constantly, continuously on this brink of the unknown, right? And this allows us to experience life as a story. And as we'll see, the story really is as humans, our foundational way of making sense of the world, right? It's how we experience the world, and it's a natural result of living in a place, in a way, in a state of being that's been slowed and stretched into this phenomenon of linear time, one thing after the other after the other. Okay, so that's one way to look at it, this linear time. And that's part of our experience. That's as I talk about later, that's not a mistake. That's a deliberate experience that we've entered into as souls incarnating, right? Linear time, constantly on the brink of the unknown, right? And so I also want to talk about a belief, a way of being that the Kabbalists espouse. And the Kabbalists I've studied with them, with some teachers of Kabbalistic dreaming and dream work. I've studied with a number of teachers, and one who is a very powerful lineage holder of healing, who used imagery to heal, was Colette Albuquerque Muscat. And she lived in Israel for many years and was known as this very powerful healer. She worked through imagery. And in one of her books, she talks about time as this luminous stacking of one point stacked upon another. And it's this luminous vertical stacking. So the Kabbalists see time as vertical, not horizontal, not linear, not one thing after the other. But what this means, with one luminous point stacked upon another, right? This means that all of time is accessible in this moment, this one moment, right? So all of your memories available now, as are your dreams, your hopes, your longings, your visions of the future, all available now in this moment. All of time available now. And so, again, there is a purpose. So coming back to this idea of linear time, it's very purposeful, it's very intentional, right? This idea of linear time, one thing after the other. And we don't find, as I learned the hard way, right? We don't find enlightenment through denying that aspect of time. The linear part with the memories and all the, we'll go into what all that means. But we can find what we call an aspect of enlightenment through engaging with that very deeply human experience. You could say three-dimensional experience, by engaging with it and through that engagement transcending. Right? So this full engagement with our experience within this linear time, when we fully engage, we actually begin to command time instead of being enthralled to it. And I just touched on this briefly, I believe, in the episode on heart creation, where we talked about how the heart, which exists in a place of timelessness, knows exactly how to work within the constructs of linear time to make sure that all gets done in the best way possible, right? So we're going to expand on that a lot more, because there's a lot more there, right? Beyond the practical application that I often use of like, hey, can you make sure I get to this place on time, right, when I need to be there, right? There's a lot more there. All right, so we're going to dive into that a lot more in this episode. And I want to just bring out a quote that I feel really encapsulates this. And it's a quote from my memoir. And it's from the preface. And I wrote, "Time itself, that implacable marcher, is revealed at last to be our servant, in thrall to our very desires." Right, so as humans, we often feel like we're at the mercy of time. It's one of those things we never seem to have enough of, right? We can have scarcity around it, all these things. So how much power would that offer to be in command of time, right? To work with time, linear time, as our servant, right? How do we get to that place? And through this episode, we are going to get closer and closer to that way of commanding time. The way we can be in our own being to begin to command time as our servant. Right? Don't you want that? I do. So let's explore it together. So I wanted to bring up actually a quote from Yeats. So you'll see, I'm oftentimes in my episodes, I get this image of me kind of walking on this path, and there's like fruit trees and there's flowers, and I'm picking fruit and I'm picking flowers and I'm bringing them in. It's like I'm offering kind of a bouquet in some ways of this. And so that quote from my memoir was one. I want to offer another one. And this is from the poem Adam's Curse by Yeats. And we're actually going to see how fitting that poem, especially the title of that poem, is in this podcast episode, because we will be addressing original sin. So just get ready. But don't worry, we'll get there. But I wanted to start by talking about this poem, Adam's Curse by Yeats. And I've loved this poem since college. And there's this beautiful line in the poem, and I'm switching the pronouns a little bit just to make it relevant to right now. Otherwise, if we go into the whole poem, and I spent so many hours sitting with this poem, but there's this one part of it that's just, I feel like it just so captures, and Yeats was a deeply mystical man, very deep, very enmeshed in the mystical arts. And so there's something in this that just seems to call to those places from far beyond, our linear rational mind. And he has this beautiful line, and I'm switching it just a little bit, but he says, "As if I had been a shell, washed by time's waters as they rose and fell about the stars and broke in days and years." Then he goes on, "I had a thought for no one but your ears." But it's a beautiful poem. I suggest you look at it. But I just want to look at this part about time's waters rising, falling, washing about the stars, breaking in days and years. And we feel this way as humans. He's putting his finger, right? He's putting pressure on this deeply human ache of our existence, where we have this ceaseless, this continual breaking of ourselves against this implacable marcher of time, right? We have this accumulation of days and years that have broken over us, sometimes broken us, right? And if you want to continue with this metaphor, there's our shores, which can become littered with, cluttered, choked with regrets, what ifs, if onlys, right? You know, to bring in another poem of the time, Robert Frost with The Road Not Taken, that's a whole other discussion, right? Because ultimately that poem brings us back to this idea that there's nothing that can't be restored. And so we look back, though, it's part of our human experience to have these memories, to have these wonderings to what if, right? What if? And with that, there comes sometimes this accumulation of regret, right? And it can feel very heavy. It can feel very heavy. We carry it with us. And so my question at this moment is, are you ready to let that go? Right? So it's one of the central questions of this podcast. Are you ready to let go of that accumulation of time, right? That's built up through our memories, through our just lived experiences, right? So to do that, let's come into the heart, right? The starting point of all journeys, all journeys that we can trust, right? And so we know, because especially in the other episode, I touched on this, but we know that the heart exists in a state of pure timelessness. But I want to lift that up a little bit, because this isn't a remote timelessness, right? This isn't this. So in the poem, when I said I have been washed by time's waters. Actually, the actual part of that poem is he's talking about the moon. Right, the moon washed by time's waters as they rose and fell and broke about the stars and days and years. And the moon, so there's this remoteness to it, right? There's this unreachable, this perfect, unreachable, untouchable aspect. And if timelessness is something beyond us, then it's not really that useful, right? Right? Because it's beyond us. It's just this thing that exists somewhere else. It's not relevant to our lives. So the heart, the timelessness of the heart is not a remote timelessness somewhere far away. The timelessness of the heart is fully engaged with, woven with our very human experience of linear time. The heart knows that. The heart knows that. It knows that our story is precious. It knows that our memories are precious, right? It knows our story and it knows our movement through time. It knows our countless and thens, right? So the timelessness of the heart is not one that denies our linear experience as humans, right? It's one that engages with it and also offers, when I was talking about two planes in the beginning, it also offers within and beyond that a transcendence into a place that holds our countless and thens, our accumulation of memories, and brings us into something larger, more expansive, more pure, right? So we've incarnated as humans. We have taken on this perception of linear time, right? That is no less real for being only one type of perception in the infinite dimensions of perception, right? It's no less real. And so what we know then is that in many ways as humans, we've come here to live the story, right? When you're reading a story, you don't know what's going to happen next. And so we have that perception of constantly being on the brink of the unknown, which means that we are always living a story. And as I talked about, the story is the basic mechanism that humans use to make sense of their existence, of their lives. So we've come here to live the story. And the other central question to this podcast episode is, well, what story, whose story are you actually living? Right? And that is the question that we're going to begin to unpick here. So, all right, let's talk about some timelines. And let's talk about how. So we talk about multiple different timelines, right? That's often something in, again, New Age mysticism we talk about. So let's talk about what is the timeline that we may be living? How is that related to stories? And then what is the way to move into what, the title of this podcast episode is Our Highest Timeline. What's the way to move into that? What is it exactly, right? And I'm going to start at the beginning, actually. And I'm going to start at the place where our story begins. And that is actually the moment of the fall, the moment of original sin. And as we'll see as I go on, that's not actually where our story begins, but that's where we perceive that it begins as humans. Okay, so strap in. In this podcast episode, I am taking on the entire concept of original sin, and we're going to dissolve it. So just... Did you know what you were getting yourself into when you hit play? Let's go. All right. So let's talk about that moment of the fall. This is something I've been just fascinated with, absorbed by since college. And you see Adam's Curse, the title of that poem. You see why that's so relevant, right? Because we're talking about the fall here. We're talking about this moment where humanity seems to have believed that it became separated from the divine, cast out of the Garden of Eden, cast out of ecstasy, of bliss, of pleasure, of worthiness, right? In many ways, it's the casting out from this place of worthiness. And in order to really talk about this, I want to bring in another concept. So just, as Yeats talked about, like washed by time's waters, my words may wash over you, some may stick, some may not. So just flow with it. Don't try to get too caught up in it, because what I'm going to introduce here is the concept of fractals. Okay, and how the concept of fractals is related to this idea of, well, all things, but I'm going to talk about it specifically as it's related to this idea of the fall and original sin. So, the idea of a fractal is that the smallest particle in existence is an exact scaled replica of the largest aspects of the universe. So by this, I mean, what we can look at is that the microbiologist, right, can come to the same conclusions about life and the nature of existence, like the ontological nature of existence, through looking at teeny tiny microparticles, the same conclusions as the astrophysicist, right, or the philosopher, right, because it's all encapsulated in that one thing. All is present in all things. Okay, so in this way, if we see one human life, one human being, one human life, the course of a human life, as a fractal, then through examining your own personal life and your own personal experiences and the evolution, the trajectory of your life, you can tap into all of the wisdom, the secrets, the questions of all of humanity, right, and the universe itself. Right, so let me talk about why I'm bringing this in right now, okay? Because we're coming back to the fall. So there was the fall of humanity, right? And again, this is not a religious podcast. Quick disclaimer. I'm just going to move my little sheepskin here. So, sorry, if you're listening and you're not watching, I just made a little adjustment to my surroundings. So coming back. So, this is not a religious podcast. However, I do often draw from wisdom traditions and very often from the Torah and the Bible. And that is because these stories, the stories of these ancient texts, have in many, many, many ways, subtle and overt, shaped our experience in the Western world, our beliefs and our personal stories in the Western world. All right, so even if you've never set foot in a temple or a synagogue or a church, right, in many ways these stories have still shaped the way you live your life and the way you think at very subtle levels. So I engage with these stories often. So I'm talking today about the story of Adam and Eve and the fall. fall from grace, right? The perceived fall from grace. So coming back to fractals, if we look at this moment in humanity where all of humanity fell from grace, cast out of the Garden of Eden, right? Cast away from God, we can see that in every individual human life, for as long as this story persists, the story of the fall, there will be in every single human being's individual life a personal moment of the fall, a personal, visceral, physical experience of that fall, that casting out, right? So what happens is that this moment, right, and this moment can be many, many things. It could be the first time that you ever felt physical pain, or it could be the first time that you were in need and didn't receive the thing that you needed. And oftentimes this happens at a very, very young age. So that's our personal moment of the fall, where we experience ourselves as separate. We experience ourselves as not getting what we need. We're cast out of this perfect union. We feel cast out because something has intervened to make us feel separate, to make us feel pain, to make us feel something that doesn't feel divine. And so what happens is that moment is often our first memory, our first real memory, our first physical memory, because it was so intense. It became imprinted very deeply on us. And again, it could be something that from the outside looks really simple. You fell and scraped your knee, right? Mom didn't come get you, dad didn't come get you, grandma didn't come get you while you were crying in your crib. You know, you don't know. It could look really simple and like from the outside not a big deal, but as a new being in the world, forming your impressions of the world, right? It suddenly forces you on levels you don't understand to be aware of of what feels like separateness. So, and I want to say for all the parents out there, there's nothing wrong with this. This is part of the human experience. We're meant to go through it right now. Okay, maybe not forever, but right now this is it. Right? And so, so this becomes our first memory. So this moment is the thing, this moment of pain, this moment of trauma, of misery, or whatever it is, this actually becomes our first memory, which makes us think that it's who we are. It makes us think that that's when we came into being, that moment of misery, of separation. So we remember only maybe that one terrible moment where we had been cast out. And we can be excused for thinking that that's who we are, that that's what this life is all about, because it's the first thing we remember, right? So we don't remember that time before, that there was a time before, and in linear time it was a time before, right? Where we had been formed of light, where we had been pronounced good, right? The true story of our origin. We remember only that part where things hurt, right? So what happens then is this pain, this trauma, right? It becomes imprinted. It becomes our story of who we are. And for each individual person, for our individual makeup, whatever it is, that can take many different forms. But it usually has something to do with, I have been shown, I've been bad, I'm being punished, and I need to somehow get back to God, right? I need to somehow prove myself in order to get back to God, right? And so this whole striving to get back to God, to get back to the divine, to get back to that state of oneness has become, in a lot of ways, the story of humanity. And what happens is that we are often stuck in these loops where we're reliving this story of our first moment of pain and trauma, which we interpret as, I have been cast away from God. There's something in me that is unworthy, and my whole existence is a journey, a striving a trial and error to get back to that place, right? And so we're living that. We're living that. But what we're really living is this story of the first trauma. Being cast out. I was cast out. There's something wrong with me. There must be something inherently wrong with me. I must be inherently bad, right? All these things, or I wouldn't have been cast out, right? And that happens for each individual person. That karmic loop looks different. And for all of humanity, right, we see in a lot of ways how we're still living that first original trauma, right? So the fractal there. And so we're living essentially a story. When there was the question of what story are we living, whose story are we living, the idea is that if we're still stuck in that loop of I was cast out, then we are not actually living our highest story or our highest timeline, you could say, because it's not divinely true, as we'll go into in a moment, right? So I want to take a moment to talk about how this timeline actually lives in our bodies. And I'm about to depart into a place that might seem really abstract. All right, so I'm going to try to explain this. And again, if you are not receiving it, just let it wash over you, and let the kind of what I'm trying to say maybe permeate in different ways. Okay, but I was shown, and by I was shown, I mean just over time received visions, wisdom, you could call it downloads, but I'm going to try to explain it here. I was shown that the timeline that we're living, what is this timeline? It is actually physically embodied in the living strands of our DNA. Okay. That even as someone who's been shown it many times, that's a little bit of a hard one for me. So we're gonna work through it together. So the timeline as it lives in the physical, right? It's enmeshed with it is the encoded matrix of our being, our DNA itself, right? And the encodements of the DNA are emanating, telling the story that we're living. Okay, so we can find it there. And so from there, it resonates, and I see it as a resonance. Our DNA itself, which has a vibration. Okay, and I know we're getting into like some really abstract territory here, so just bear with me because I'm going to come back to some concrete, practical things. I always do. But just bear with me here because we're going to go kind of far out. So the DNA itself has a vibration. It can't be heard by like the physical ear, but it's heard within the larger resonance of the universe, the vibration of our DNA, right? And so our timeline, like we see it, we feel it, we experience it as one thing after another, our countless and thens. But what's actually happening is our timeline is encoded in our DNA itself, and it resonates outwards in almost like you could see if you were looking at like a three-dimensional sphere around you. An unseen, intangible, three-dimensional sphere around you. Your vibration. We talk about vibration, we talk about resonance. It's encoded, it's vibrating, it's emanating from your DNA itself. Okay? So, what does this have to do with the fall? So the karma, we could say, and the karma I'm defining here as the stories we're telling. The stories we're telling that are not in perfect alignment with actual divine truth. The stories we're telling as a result from whatever our first traumatic experience was. This lives like dark threads, and I see it as dark threads, and I'll explain why I see it as dark threads, wound around and through our DNA itself. So it is not our perfect crystalline form, but it is so closely embedded with it that we mistake it for who we are. Right? And so I saw this, and I want to say about wound, it's wound around, and the other way to pronounce that is wound. Okay, so these dark threads that are wound in our DNA is the wound that we are healing. We're going to talk about how we can do that, like how that can come about. Okay, so, and I do want to give a shout out to Richard Rudd, author of The Gene Keys, for making that connection between this this darkness wound within our DNA, dark threads, and the idea of wound and wound being really connected. So I want to give that a shout. If you haven't read The Gene Keys, it's a really good book. Coming back. So the way I saw this, and the way this kind of came to me as a revelation, was I meditate every morning on a good, really good day. I'm in there for 40, 50 minutes. Like, I wake up early just to kind of go in, and that's where I receive a lot of messages. And sometimes I get visions in those places. I always get messages, and I sometimes get visions. And one meditation, I was very unexpectedly taken to an Arcturian healing chamber. And this is where, like, the woo, kind of what you could say, wow, this lady, maybe this is where it's going to come out a little bit. But just know, again, I'm going to always bring it back to something practical, actionable for you. But you may as well know a little bit of my process. So I was taken to, in my meditation, moved into, in my like light body, moved into an Arcturian healing chamber. And if you aren't aware of the Arcturians, there's so much information out there on them. My experience of them is as a very, very, very precise, powerful race of healers. And they work very, very closely with humanity. They're pure, unconditional love, but they're also extremely, in my experience of them, extremely scientific, extremely precise. They have a lot of kinds of like spiritual technology, healing technology that they can offer. And so in some ways, the Arcturians feel a little bit masculine in that way. They're super, like if they would be a race of like super powerful, multidimensional surgeons, right? They're very precise, very loving. Anyway, so I come in and they can offer different types of healing, spiritual healing, multidimensional healing, that because they've perfected these spiritual technologies, you can't find with any other race of beings. They're always available, by the way. There's nothing exclusive about them. If you want to work with them, they'll work with you. They'll work with you in your dreams. They'll work with you in your meditations. They'll work with you as you're walking around, right? Like in fact, I can feel them really present right now. So just to give an example of stuff that they're capable of, right? So I'm moved in my meditation. I'm taken up and out. I'm moved into this Arcturian healing chamber, and this was the moment where I was going to be the real deep process of dissolving karma was going to be really touched off. And of course, we've been doing that. I've been doing this for a long time. But there was a really powerful transformative step threshold I was going to cross over in this meditation. I was told that. What I received was this vision. So I'm lying, like my light body is lying down, and they are able to lift up and out all at once the dark strands of story and karma and trauma and stuff that isn't truly my divine self, my higher self. They're able to lift it up and out of my body itself. And as I saw it, I understood, because it was lifted up and out from every strand of DNA in my body, which obviously goes through every cell, right? So what I saw was this perfect three-dimensional replica of my body, many, many, many layers enmeshed of dark threads, lifted up and out. Heaviness. It was very heavy, very, very dense. Dense is the word, because in our three-dimensional bodies, right, we have all these layers. And so they were able to lift it up and out. And so I saw this three-dimensional replica of my own body formed by these dark, heavy, dense threads of karma, of stories, of pain, of trauma, of all these things, right, that have gone into the human experience. The human experience of telling, retelling what we perceived as our origin, which was that time of the fall. So, as they drew out this three-dimensional enmeshed, heavy, dense, karmic imprint, you could say, it dissolved. It dissolved. And it dissolved through the understanding that before there was ever a karmic imprint, before there was ever a moment of the fall, there was the true self, the first light, the being that was formed of light and pronounced good. And that, when we talked about in the last episode, we talked about the heart as the ultimate overrider. And that is the ultimate overrider of all karma, right? And we're going to talk about what exactly that first light can sound like in our language. Take a sip of water. We are getting into it. So one of the knowings that came from that, when I saw this, these dark, dense, heavy threads being lifted out, dissolved, one of the things that came from that was this understanding that our timeline is both malleable, mutable, and inevitable. Okay, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, because we're gonna skate really close to this idea of self-blame. Okay, and we're going to go there, and then we're going to move away from it. Okay, so this idea of inevitability, this idea of frequency, this idea of resonance, in just a minute, we're going to go into that, right? And we're going to really take it on. We're going to skate close to it, and then we're going to show how it's not true. Okay, so I want you to hold this idea of this timeline, the emanation, the timeline being the emanation of your DNA, the frequency of your being as almost like the DNA is strands, like resonating at a certain vibration. And with those dark, heavy threads within them, they can't resonate fully, freely, right? Transcendently. Okay, so the idea of that is always what you're emanating. That's the inevitability of your life. But then also the idea that all of this is immediately, instantaneously able to dissolve. Okay. So just a quick, before I move into this next vision that I received that's going to help kind of bring all this together, remembering that there's nothing that can't be restored. Okay, the central theme of this podcast episode, nothing that can't be restored, right? And this idea of time being vertical, all accessed in the moment, which means that healing can be instantaneous. That we don't have to wait years and years and years for it to happen. Okay, so there's nothing that can't be restored, and that restoration can be instantaneous. All right, so let's go into how that can happen. First, I want to pivot for 1 second. I want to talk about, this is something I wrote about in my first book, The New Eden, Paradise Retold. And as I was sitting, as I have been sitting with the idea of the fall since, well, I could say God only knows how long, but I first became really, really interested in it when I was in college. Take another sip of water here. We're on a roll, aren't we? All right. So this first, let's see. So where I was first coming back to this vision. Sorry, just kind of recalibrating. So coming back to this vision, I was gifted with a vision. I was in a healing ceremony, and actually in a medicine ceremony. And I received a vision that helped me understand the meaning of true forgiveness, the meaning of redemption, the meaning of instantaneous restoration. And this vision, which I will try to describe to you because it was a full-bodied experience, right? The earth, I wrote in my book, The New Eden, Paradise Retold, I wrote, the earth became a sinuous being, glowing star bright in the cosmos. So the earth was transformed into a being, a sinuous star bright being. And then I saw, what I became aware of was this counterpart to the earth. And if you can watch the video, my hands are moving in the way that they were moving, right? But I'll explain that if you're just listening. So not just listening, it's a lot to take in. But if you're listening, I'll explain what I mean. So I saw this, the earth, and then the earth also represented humanity. The earth represented the ego, okay, which is, again, it's a part of our experience, the ego. It's not something to be rejected. It's something the heart knows how to work with. So I saw the ego. I saw, also represented as earth, also represented as humanity. I saw it moving, right? And then I saw its counterpart, its perfect counterpart, the divine. And I wrote, I saw them cleaving so closely that not a sliver of space lay between. Every time ego, human, earth took an erratic step, divine, God, was there, moving effortlessly in concert, transforming the chaos of our earth into a dance. So I want that to sink in for a moment. In many ways, this vision completely eradicates the idea that there was ever a fall in the first place. What I witnessed was the wild, agonizing, exhilarating, heartbreaking dance of humanity. And I saw it, and I saw that without the divine, it really does look and feel like destruction, chaos. Right? But with God, with the divine as our dance partner, right, it becomes this dance of ineffable power and beauty. And what I really, really saw was that it wasn't that God stepped in as our dance partner. It was that the divine had been there all along, the entire time, right? So what this vision offers is something actually very practical and very immediate that has the capacity to erase all regret. Okay, so what I saw was that there was never a choice, never a decision, never a move that anyone has ever made that has ever brought them one sliver farther away from the divine. Every time we take a step in our lives, right? So let me come back. There's almost this way that we view, right? When we're looking through the lens of the fall, when we're looking through the lens of I was cast out, I did something bad, I must be bad, I was cast out, and we're trying to find our way back to that place of unity, to that place of oneness, right? First of all, that's a completely human experience. The divine has never left us. Never. But when we're looking through that separate, when it feels like the veil of separation came in, we lost sight of God. We thought that we'd been cast out, cast away. When we're looking through that, we begin to see life as this, almost like this yardstick. Like, okay, this decision resulted in that. Therefore, because I didn't like that outcome, I must be bad. That was a mistake. Because this decision resulted in something I enjoyed or liked, then that decision was good and brought me closer to God. So we're always in this place of separation because we're trying to find our way back to God, and we're assessing our movement based on the outcomes of our choices and our decisions. But what this vision showed is that there was never a choice or never a decision that separated us from God. This means, if you can really feel this in your body, this means that no one ever has ever made a mistake. And that's the waterfall of forgiveness we're talking about. And maybe you look at other people and other movements and other things and things that have happened in humanity and you say, that's a huge mistake, right? Let's just bring it back to your own life right now. What this means is that you have never made a mistake, because every move, every choice, every decision you've ever made has always been in perfect harmony with God, with the divine within you. There's never been anything they couldn't handle. There's never been anything that wrong-footed them. Like, you never made a step in the dance where the divine was like, oops, I got to recalibrate. No, divine has always been there, right there with you. Step, 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 choice, decision, step. None of it has been a mistake. None of it has brought you farther from God. Okay, so what is the practical and immediate response? It's that this understanding, this knowing, this story, if we're going to come back to story, this has the capacity to erase all regret. This is the waterfall of forgiveness, of grace, of self-forgiveness. Right? So let's talk then about what we're already talking about. What I just want to name is we're talking about the unconditional nature of divine presence in your life right now. Right now. Every aspect of your life, the divine is with you. Right? It is unconditional. We're talking right now about the story that erases overrides, dissolves all of the other stories that have to do with separation, pain, unworthiness. We're talking about inherent, unconditional worthiness, right? So when we're looking at this yardstick of our life, we're saying, oh, I made that choice and this happened, and I made choice and this happened, and that didn't work out, so like I must be unworthy. God's not playing that game. The divine isn't playing that game. If we're looking at the idea of story and what's true and not true, that's actually not that's not a divine truth. That's not the way that, if we're looking at the world through the lens of our perfect divine nature, that's not actually what's happening at all. That's not true. Right? So what we can start to understand is that all of our every moment we're held in this larger divine circle of unconditional grace, unconditional true worthiness. And so now I want to come back to where I was talking a little bit about, like, so we have our timeline. It emanates from our DNA, right? We have our frequency, our inherent, what feels like an inherent frequency, right? But it's just the frequency of our being at that time, based on how deeply wound about us are these karmic stories. Right? So we have this frequency, and now we're going to kind of take on this very crippling gesture that we make of self-blame. Okay, and we're going to take it on. We're going to dissolve it right now. So sometimes we feel sad, depressed, lonely, unhappy, right? Sometimes we have been led into situations that demand something of us, demand a stepping into power, demand a greater command of our lives, demand a stepping out of victimhood, right? We experience, right? So we had that first experience of the fall as maybe we were really little, and then that lens helped us to define how we experience pain from then on, right? So we got really sick, and so this must mean I did something wrong. I went into debt, so this must mean I did something wrong. I really regret that decision because it led to this kind of pain, or this relationship that hurt me, or whatever, right? And so we see that, like, there's this tendency to blame ourselves based on the circumstances of our lives. We also see that when we emanate this frequency, right, the inevitability of what, there's that, I think it's really specious and actually kind of reductive, but if we're going to call in, the way it's conceived of, right? I think, but the law, if we talk about the law of attraction, we're kind of talking about that on some level, like our emanating frequency is what we bring into our life. So then that leads to, if you're not coming from this place of the divine has never left me, that leads to a lot of self-blame, right? And that is just not the way that we're going to operate anymore. So you might feel sometimes sad, depressed, lonely. You might feel like your world is falling apart, right? That doesn't mean you did anything wrong. Let me say that again. That doesn't mean you did anything wrong. That is a tough one, right? Because we're used to seeing the circumstances of our life as reflecting whether or not we did something right or wrong. Okay? Your life might be falling apart around you. That doesn't mean you did anything wrong. Let me take a step back there and go into that more. So I believe it was episode on heart creation, we talked about how the movement into creation from the heart is actually a sumptuous experience, a loving experience, because no matter what happens, we're always coming back to that self-love. What do I need in this moment? How can I care for myself in this moment? How can I nourish myself in this moment? Right? And in that way, we're able to transmute that frequency into something beautiful. So I will say that I went through, you could call it a period of dark night of the soul, if you wanted to. That's not far off. And I would say for me, it lasted about 5 years. And in that time, it would be really easy to say, like, all this hard, challenging, all these things are happening to me. I must have done something wrong to be here, right? But what I kept getting led into and through was that within these challenges, within these difficulties, right, there was always a way to reorient so that I was dissolving the stories of self-blame that were wound around, you could say, even my DNA itself. And I was clearing out these stories from from the genetics, my very genetics, right? The things that make up the building blocks, the encodements that make up my body. So this brings us to the idea of unconditional worthiness. And when we really get this, suddenly all the circumstances of our life begins to lighten. Because we no longer, when we know we are unconditionally worthy, then what that means is that no matter how much debt, misery, car breaks down, whatever happens, people get mad at you, like you go to jail, like whatever, none of that has anything to do with your actual inherent divine worthiness, right? You lose a bunch of money, it doesn't mean God loves you any less. It doesn't mean you're any farther from the divine, right? That yardstick goes away. That yardstick of, am I closer or farther to the divine right now? Because I know I was cast out of Eden and I'm trying to get back into Eden, right? All that goes away. You're just in Eden all the time. So the circumstances of your life take on almost like it's not that they're still poignant, they're still beautiful, you're still living them, but they take on a little bit less importance. Like they stop defining who you actually are, right? And it just becomes part of the human experience of being within linear time. Those circumstances, here's what I'm trying to say. The circumstances of your life stop being your story. When we're saying whose story are we telling? What story are we telling? The circumstances of your life are not your story. It is not who you are. Because there is a much more clear and eternal divine truth that who you are is love. And who you are is inherently worthy. And that is your story. That's your main story. Then everything else is just details. That inherent worthiness, it's inherent. It cannot be taken from you. It cannot. This becomes the pulse, the drumbeat of your life. This story, I'm inherently worthy. I'm an inherently divine being. I am inherently divine. This is your story. And with that as your story, all the other stuff dissolves. The stories of being unworthy, the stories of needing to find your way back, the story of mistakes, the story of regrets, the accumulation we talked about of memories, of time. When you look back, and this is something the Kabbalists do, they do something called reversing. There's something I do in my shamanic journeys, but reversing, you go back and you rewrite the story through the lens of your higher self. And so when you look back on every single memory of anything that's ever happened, right, suddenly it's illuminated, it's irradiated with divine light. Your higher self is there telling the story of your inherent worthiness. That time my car broke down or I lost all that money, my divine self was there and I was inherently worthy, and it doesn't really matter that much. Because there's nothing here that can change. Nothing you've done, said, chosen, eaten, right? That extra cookie you had after dinner, your divine self is standing right there. That's the story. I'm inherently worthy. I'm going to eat this cookie. It could be that small. It could be that simple. It could be that, like that regret. I did all those drugs all those years ago. I think it messed up my brain. There is nothing that can't be restored. There is nothing that can't be healed. And it starts with this story, with living this story. Once you live the story, I'm inherently worthy. I'm inherently essential, and that cannot be taken away. Once you start living that story, that's what emanates from your being. That's the timeline. And I almost see the timeline as this frequency field around you, like this resonance field around you as played by the very strands of your DNA. Like your DNA is like a musical instrument, like the strings, right? And it's playing it and it's vibrating. And this story, I'm inherently worthy, that dissolves everything else. It's the ace card, it's the ultimate overrider, right? And so in this way, we can engage with linear time. We can know that we have a past. We can know that we're moving into a future. And we can also know that the one drumbeat of all of it is just that I am inherently worthy. And that defines every moment of our lives. And this way we can start to engage with time, and then we transcend it. Right? Because we can move back in the past and let that be true. And we know that every movement we make in the future, that's just true. With that, fear dissolves, regret dissolves. We just become this one encapsulated moment. So ultimately, what we're doing is we're using linear time as a mechanism to collapse itself. We move back to that moment of trauma, that our own personal fall. As a fractal of humanity, we do that. And then we move to that time just before it, when we were irradiated with light, when we were aware of our own unconditional worthiness, and we say, that's the truth of who I am. That's my origin story. That's my origin story, and that's who I always am and always will be. Not that moment of pain, not that moment of misery, but that when I was pronounced good, I still am, and I always have been, and I always will be. And so with this story, I'm inherently worthy. When that becomes the story that we live, that's an immediate dissolution of original sin. And dissolution means it's gone forever. And that's what we're moving toward as a fractal, right? So each human being who does this is a fractal of the larger humanity, and that's where we're moving as a species, as a race. We're moving to that point where we dissolve original sin, and that's no longer our story. And we have to get to the point where we're ready to let it go, because it has defined our existence for so long. But the beauty and the joy and the relaxation on the other side is so sumptuous, so beautiful, so pleasurable that it's not that the pain and the trauma and the dark wounds that wind their way around our genetics and get passed on, like that's just not going to be appealing anymore. Because we've touched onto something much more beautiful, much more real, much more true. I'm inherently worthy. I'm inherently divine. Nothing can ever change that, and nothing ever has. So, let's emanate those stories, that story, right? And from that story, we see there's nothing that can't be restored. In fact, the idea of restoration falls away because there was never any need for it in the first place, because we've always just been divine in that perfect dance, with God. Never a misstep, never a mistake. Let's emanate that story. And then just watch. Let's just watch how our life and how the world around us changes. This has been a beautiful journey with you all, the 4th episode of When the Heart Leads. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Newburgh. To learn more about my work, you can visit my website, www.booksofeden.com. It has more about my work, my background, the books I've written. Thank you so much for tuning in. From my heart to yours, until next time.